So good to be with you all. Wow, you guys are alive today. You're awake. That is a gift. First of all, I would just like to say thank you so much, Jonathan, for leading us in that section of the Pulse. As we were saying, we want this space to be a reflection of our community, of what's going on. So if you have prayer requests, you have things in your life you're hoping and praying for God to act on, we would love to stand in the gap. We would love to represent those things. So the second thing I want to say is, what's up, Keith? Welcome, brother. So good to see you, man. Keith is a longtime friend. He's a longtime Elevate family member, and he's visiting today. So glad you're here, man. I'm going to pray now, and we're going to dive straight in. Jesus, thank you so much for your love. Your presence is a promise to us, God. We can take it to the bank. Thank you for your consistency, for your constancy, for your goodness. Would you be with us here in this time, in this space? Would you speak, God? Could you give us ears to hear you? We pray this in your name. And everyone said together, amen. So it was my younger brother's birthday this week. Now, my brother he's currently on a cruise for his birthday, but he tends to watch my sermons almost every week. What a guy, what a gift, and I appreciate that. Here I have a sideways, I think, a picture of him and I as younger creatures, and I wanted to tell a little story this morning to start things off about my brother. His name is Andrew. He's 2 years younger than me. Hopefully, maybe at some point you get to meet him sometime when he comes to visit, but him and his wife will visit eventually. And my little nephew, Micah. Fantastic. Very cute. But this is my brother, Andrew, and he's a couple years younger than me. And just for about 20 days, we're 1 year apart because my birthday is November 28th. His is November 6th. So right now, he's talking a big game. The other night on FaceTime, he's just like, I'm just 1 year younger. And I'm just like, yeah, okay. You're not close to middle age yet. Middle age hasn't hit you. But I wanted to tell a little story because my brother and I, we've always been pretty close throughout the years when we were younger. I prided on myself on the fact that we almost never had a fight. But in that never, before that, I don't know if you caught that first word, almost, because there was one incident, and we call it the remote controller incident, because we had a single fight when we were I must have been 12, maybe he was 10, and I remember he was watching his show. Wow, I almost flipped it, my bad. He was watching his show, I remember, in our family room, and I came home, I came over to the family room this afternoon, whatever it was, after school, and I snatched the controller from him, and I turned the channel to my show, what I wanted to watch. Crazy, diabolical, typical older sibling behavior. For those of you who are middle or younger siblings, I'm so sorry. For those of you in the space, Gwen, I'm sorry for what? Yes, I am so sorry for you who are younger siblings, because us older siblings, we can be a handful sometimes, and in that moment, I was a handful, and of course, he got upset. He said to me, what are you doing? Why are you taking the remote control? And I'm like, I'm going to watch my show. I don't care about this dumb show that you're watching. Ugh, it wasn't good. And so things escalated, and we ended up fighting over this remote control, literally physically wrestling over this remote, to the point where, and of course, I was older, so I had the benefit, the advantage of strength of age on my side, and I took the controller. And my brother, I remember him saying 3 words that perhaps if you have had siblings or you've been on any playground, you've heard before. That's not fair. That's not fair, he said to me. And of course, it wasn't fair. It was unjust what I had done. It was not fair. Perhaps if you are a parent, you have heard these 3 words before, or perhaps if you've been a young person at any stage in your life, you've heard these words before. That's not fair. We say it often and young. We say it very young. It seems from a very young age we already have a concept of fairness. We already seem to understand that certain things are fair and unfair, just and unjust. It seems to be a primal truth about the human instinct, perhaps. And it doesn't stop at childhood. In fact, the cry of "that's not fair," it echoes into adulthood as well, right? This is why we have laws, right? This is why we have statutes and boundaries in the world. This is why we have speeding limits, right? In order to ensure that things are just for others, so that our freedoms don't infringe on the safety of other people, right? Just the other day, I was driving down the highway, and I got hit by a log. Yes, I got hit by a log. So I was driving on the highway. I'm forgetting where I was. I was coming from visiting some friends up in Kansas City, and I was driving down the highway. I had just I was nearing Dallas from the north, and I was on this highway, and there was this truck traveling in front of me, and in his pickup, he just had a bunch of firewood, like hefty firewood logs. And immediately I was like, this is a little suspicious, because they weren't really like secure. There was a tarp and it was blowing in the wind, and there was like a single one of those bungees, and it was like haphazardly, and I'm sure the guy he was doing his best, I too have been in the struggle, but I was a little bit concerned. Then, out of nowhere, a log flies out of his pickup bed and onto the highway. We're going 75 miles per hour, right? It flies out of the pickup bed, and it just bounces on the highway, and the car in front of me, so of course, swerves to avoid. Luckily, it goes to the side. I'm like, that was a close call. I'm safe. The guy in front of me is like, nope. He moves out of the lane, and I'm like, okay, we're good. Everything's fine. Log number 2, it comes. And you ever been in a moment, like a movie moment, where it's like slow motion, and you're like, no, and it's coming for you? That's literally where I was at in that moment in time. And for some reason, usually I would, but this time, some part of my brain, the lizard brain perhaps in the back, was like, it's not going to hit you. You don't need a dodge. I don't know why I thought that. So I just kept on going, and it smacked me right in the front of the bumper and hit me full on, tore off a whole bunch of the paint on the front of my bumper. Luckily, didn't do too much damage, but I was okay. Didn't hit the windshield or anything. But I got smacked by a log on the highway. And man, the thought I was thinking when I got out of my car and looked at the front, my thought was, that's not fair. How could he do this? What's going on? Secure your logs with more than a single bungee cord. You said scraps? Yeah, you need 6. For real. So I felt that just recently, that the feeling in the chest, that's not fair. And even in the moment right after, luckily, I don't know how I had the wherewithal to do this, but I pull out my phone while I was driving, sorry Mom, and I took a picture of this guy's license plate, and I got him. I got him. So I called my insurance, and I was like, hey, I'm here to report. And they said, do you have any license plate information? I said, yes, I do. I do have license plate information. Now, of course, the Jesus way, the biblical way, is not to go for retribution, correct, right? But for justice, right? Not for retribution. Justice and retribution are 2 different things, and we don't have time to go into all of that today. But my goal in calling my insurance company was not to destroy this person's life, not to hurt them personally, right? Not to even get revenge or retribution, just to simply seek, compensation, to simply seek some sort of recompense, some sort of fixing, some ailing of the damage that had been done, right? But some things in life are not so black and white, right? Sometimes damage is done to us, and it's not so simple to fix the pain. And so in those moments of our lives, I think sometimes we cry out, man, that's not fair. How could they have done this to me? How could this have happened? God, how could you, perhaps, have let this happen? There are moments that I think we face like that. If you have been in a scenario like that, I believe you will resonate with this part of our text today. We are in Exodus chapter 34. We've been in a series called God Has a Name. We're coming to an end now. We only have one more week. Pastor Michael and I have been working through Exodus chapter 34. And we are almost near the end. And so I want to read a text for you. This is verse 7. And it says, keeping steadfast love for thousands. Now, a brief pause. This is God describing himself, right? We remember our context. Moses is on Mount Sinai, and God passes before him, and he proclaims his name, and then he describes what his name means, what his character is like. And this is a part of it. He says, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. Ooh, hefty. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So that first part we read, I think, right, and it's easy to look at and be like, man, that's all warm and fuzzy. This sounds like the God that I know from Jesus, from the New Testament, right? This seems like Jesus, right? Keeping steadfast love for thousands. That's beautiful. That makes me feel good. But then we continue reading. It says, who will by no means clear the guilty. Wait, I thought God was a forgiver. And then it says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children. So is God visiting the sins of my parents upon me? Are we being punished for the sins of our ancestors, for those who came before? They made a mistake, and now God is like, well, your father made this mistake, so I'm going to punish you for it. That's why you have a hard life, because your parents made mistakes. I think it could be easier for us to read it this way. But I would like to submit to you, perhaps there's a different understanding that God is trying to help us grasp here. And to do that, I want us to use this image as a lens. I have this image of Lady Justice for you. Now, perhaps you've seen this image before. This is Lady Justice. You find this all over the place. Often it's in Washington, D.C. It's often, it'll be erected at courthouses and things like that. And it's an old image, goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, and it's really a symbol for justice, right? The scales of what is just. If something happens to you that makes the scales weigh down a little bit, then there needs to be something to even the scales. This is often how we think about justice, is, man, there needs to be an evening of the scales. You need to make it right? That's something that my mom would say to me as a child if I bullied my younger brother or my younger sister. She would say, okay, well, you got to go make it right. What does that mean? Well, this is what we mean by that, right? Well, you need to go even the scales. You harmed them in some way, so you need to apologize and restitution if possible, right? There needs to be some sort of evening of the scales. I'd like to submit to you that we can read this text through the lens of these scales, but perhaps in an unconventional way. John Mark Comer has a book also called God Has a Name, and he talks about this text all throughout this book. And in it, he uses this image as a way to explain what God is trying to get at. And I want to read a quote from him. This is from page 233. It says, look at this scale as we read this text. God's mercy seems to be far more heavily weighted than his justice here. Interesting. His mercy seems to be heavily weighted. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that God says, I'm keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. If you were here last week, we talked about what that means, iniquity, transgression, and sin. God is forgiving crookedness, the crookedness in our heart, right? He's forgiving our tendency to be betrayers, right? And God is forgiving every time we miss the mark of loving one another well. God forgives all of those things, all these things that have real consequences. And sometimes we face the consequences, right, in our lives. But God is a forgiver. God forgives this tendency in our heart to be people of sin and iniquity, transgression. He says, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, but who by no means clear the guilty. And then it says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. What is he getting at? Well, what Comer makes the argument in his book, he essentially argues that really what's going on here is God is weighing his mercy, his steadfast love to thousands of generations. And then on the other hand, there's only to the third and fourth generation that God is visiting the iniquity of. Now, we're going to talk about what it means to visit iniquity. But just on a base level, it seems, on a surface level, this could be read as a little bit difficult, as a little bit condemnatory. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we are able to see, oh no, actually, God is heavily weighted on the side of mercy, right? God is heavily weighted on the side of forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin because he's doing it for thousands, right? And the way the Hebrew is written, it's this sort of, it's this Hebrew verbal technique where they have two things on one side, and they're saying, okay, over here we have thousands of generations, right? But here on the other hand, we have just the third and the fourth generation. And so basically what it's saying is like, man, he's keeping steadfast love. His steadfast love goes, the arc of it, it just goes on and on and on through generation after generation after generation. God is loving over and over and over again to every single new generation. But this is actually a limiter, where God is saying, to the third and fourth generation, I'm going to visit iniquity over and over and over. But only to the third or fourth. After that, it's over. Only to the third or fourth. So let's continue going, because I think it could be easy for us to conclude then, man, is God kind of two-faced then? It seems like he's kind of talking on both sides of his mouth here. Like, what's going on? Is God a little bit two-faced? What does this actually look like? Well, I think there's a story that helps us a little bit. Numbers chapter 14. This is a part of the story where the children of Israel, they find themselves at the edge of the promised land, right? They've been on this great trek, this great quest, this great journey through the wilderness God has brought them, and finally they're at the promised land. They're at the very edge, right? And as the story goes, they send out two people to basically scout it out, right? Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua and Caleb, they go and they scout it out. They come back, they report back, and you're like, wow, it's beautiful. It's this amazing land. Like, wow, God has really brought us here. But there are some really powerful enemies there as well. And the people, they're afraid. So they actually rebel. They want to stone Caleb and Joshua. They want to murder them. And they said, take us back to Egypt. They've made it all the way to the promised land, and they're still saying, take us back to Egypt, all the way. And in fact, this is actually the 10th time the people rise up in rebellion against where God's trying to bring them. So he's tried over and over and over and over again, and over again, they follow for a little bit, and then they rebel. They follow for a little bit, and then they rebel. Does that sound a little familiar? I see that pattern sometimes in my own life. Following God for a little while, and then, God, I don't know if I'm just going to ignore you for a little bit. I don't know if, oh, God, I see what you're calling me towards. I see what you're calling me to give up. I see what you're calling, this stand you're calling me to make, this practice you're calling me to change. But I'm not really. I think the children of Israel, they echo us, or perhaps we echo them. And so they find themselves on the edge of the promised land, and listen to this. This is exactly what Moses says to God, because Moses begins to debate with God. And he says, no, don't give up on these people. We've made it this far. Don't give up. He says, and now please let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, saying, the Lord is slow to anger. He says, let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, right? Remember, God, when you promised us at the beginning of this journey, he says, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity, transgression. He will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth. Please, and then he begs, please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of her steadfast love. So interestingly enough, Moses doesn't see this text as duplicitous. He doesn't see it as God talking out of both sides of his mouth. He actually appeals to the whole thing when he's like, God, please forgive your children. Right? He says, hey, God, remember when you said this? This is who you are. Could you stay true to that? And apparently Moses doesn't see a problem. He doesn't see the second half as in conflict with forgiveness. In fact, he sees the second half as integral to forgiveness, that God visits iniquity on the children of the third and fourth, right? He sees that as integral. Why? What is happening here? Well, I believe we learn two brief lessons from this part of the text, from this story, and I want to share them with you in the couple minutes we have left. First brief lesson is that justice matters to God. Justice actually matters to God. We see this when God says, I'm forgiving, I'm steadfast in my love, I'm keeping faithfulness for thousands and thousands. But also I will not clear the guilty. God is not a pushover. God will not be mocked. God cares about justice. It's important to him, right? This is actually something fundamental about God's character that he wants us to understand, that he actually cares about justice in the world. John Mark Comer, he says it like this as he continues on. He describes it this way. I love this description. He says, His steady, unrelenting, unremitting, uncompromising antagonism to evil in all of its forms and manifestations. This is what God is like. God has a steady antagonism against evil, against injustice in the world, against brokenness, against darkness. This is who God is, fundamental to his character. God is against and opposes evil and injustice in the world. So we see that God actually sees, that he has an eye when injustice takes place, right? We see this in the story of Cain and Abel, right? The first murder ever that takes place, right? Cain murders his brother. There's blood on the ground. And the way the Hebrew is written is so interesting. God doesn't even come from anywhere in the Hebrew. God is just, it's like he was there the whole time. It just says, Cain murdered his brother, and then God speaks. And God is like, what's happening? What's going on here? Your brother's blood is crying out to me. I hear the cry of it from the ground. So God is not aloof. He's not ambivalent to the pain in the world. In fact, he sees when injustice takes place. I think this should comfort us, right? This is a good God, right? This is actually something amazing, right? This is something beautiful because we long for a God who actually is a just God, a God who looks at evil in the world and says, that's wrong and that needs to end, and I'm going to end it. This is God on his day of the Lord energy, right? When he comes in the end and he ends all evil and injustice forever, right? This is the promise. This is our hope, right? I think it should give us hope, especially in times that can be really heavy and difficult, right? As we're looking around the world and we're saying, man, there's some pain out here and there's some pain here. There's some injustice taking place here, injustice taking place there. Man, what's going to happen? God, where are you? And God says, don't worry, because there will come a day. There will come a day when this will end. I think this actually has some implications for us as well. If God is a God of justice, ought the church, ought his people be people of justice too? Right? Ought his people be people who are looking around our families, our communities, our countries, the world, and ought we to be the ones saying, man, our God is a God of justice. Our God stands against injustice taking place. And ought we have a lens, right, for our families, for our communities, for our countries, for the world that says, man, we have a lens, we have an infrared goggles, and we're looking for it, and we're saying, okay, over here I see some injustice taking place. Now we're going to actually act, and we're going to actually act to end that injustice, right? So Christians, believers, the church, people of this God, we should have God's eyes for the world, right? That means we need to be asking some questions, I think. I think maybe we need to be a little more curious, right? I think we need to ask questions like, man, what's going on in South Sudan right now? What's happening there? There's people dying. What's going on, right? And this is not a political thing, right? This is not a political angle. This is because we have infrared justice goggles like our God, right? And so we're looking out at the world. And we're saying, man, there's injustice going on. Let me do some research. Let me try and let me check to make sure my sources are actually telling me that, like, they don't have an agenda. They're not trying to manipulate me. Let me actually, let me go to the scholars. Let me see, man, what are the people on the ground saying, right? What's the global consensus in the scholarly community on these things, right? We need to be intentional and ask some questions, right? What's going on in South Sudan? What's going on in Gaza? What's going on? Right? We need to have eyes to see what's happening. What's going on in Israel? What's going on in the Congo? Right? What's going on with the slave labor that allows me to have this iPhone? Right? That exists. What's happening? And the church, we should be at the forefront of asking these questions, right? It shouldn't be the world that's asking these questions. We should be at the forefront of asking these questions because our God is a God who sees, who has a lens. For a single man, for Abel, for his blood, a single person dies and God is there. His presence is there and he says, man, I care about this. What happened? And he's seeking accountability. He's saying, no, this doesn't stand. He has an opinion about it. He has an agenda, right? So that's the first thing we learn. The second thing we learn is that God is actually a God of redemptive accountability. God is a God of redemptive accountability. What does this mean? Well, this circles us back to the fact that God actually visits iniquity upon the third and fourth generation. What does that mean? Well, if you were in Summit last week, Pastor Michael, he's been beating me a little bit. He's been speeding through the text faster. So he talked about this last week. And he talked about the Hebrew word pachad. Can you say that with me? Pachad. Pachad. And basically what it means is it means to attend or to care for. Interesting. So God says that he visits the iniquity to the third and fourth generation. And some translations will use the word punish. He punishes the third and fourth generation. But pachad, if it means to attend to care for, if it means to take note of an iniquity, which if we remember, right, iniquity, it means avon, it's a crookedness, right, it's a bentness. So God takes note of iniquity, and he attends to it, almost like an attending physician, right? If you've heard that term, attending physician, you go to the hospital, you go to the doctor, and you have an attending physician. God is like an attending physician to every generation, to the third and the fourth generation. I think this is a really important idea because some of us, we were raised with the concept of generational sin, right? That's a familiar term. Raised with the concept of generational sin, this idea that certain sins are passed along generation to generation to generation. And of course, this is a biblical idea. We see it right here in this text. But some of us are raised with the idea that it's God who does the generational sin, that it's God who's like, well, your father didn't conquer this sin, so I'm going to put it on you now. It's you. And in fact, you're guilty of that. But that can't be the case. That can't be the case for three reasons. Number one, it's because this word pakad, it means to attend. Number two, because Jesus, when confronted with this idea, Jesus rejects this idea, right? Y'all remember the story. We've talked about it many times in our space. The story where his disciples, they see a man who's afflicted on the ground, right? And they say, man, who caused this? Was it him? Who sinned so that this man is like this? Was it him or was it his parents? And do you remember what Jesus says? He says, neither. He says neither. It doesn't work that way. That's actually not how it works. God doesn't operate that way. God isn't saying, well, your parents sinned, so now I'm going to punish you with the hard life. That's not how God isn't vindictive and petty like that. That's not how it works. But generational sin is a very real thing. We find that sin actually has consequences generationally, that it's actually passed down, right? So if you're a child of divorce, right, that affects you in some way, right? If your parents were children of divorce. I once did a family tree in seminary where I had to trace like all the way up to 6 generations. And I found that there were 5 generations of Lyder men who cheated on their wives and ended up in divorce. 5 generations. I found that I was a part of a line of this generational sin of infidelity, right? So these things, they are passed on and they're modeled and they're practiced, and perhaps you have similar stories in your life. Maybe that's not the thing for you and your family, but maybe I bet you could identify perhaps what it is. There seems to be these tendencies that follow us, right? But we find that God actually cares about those things. That instead of God causing these things and punishing us for these things, God is like an attending physician, and he's coming to us with his hands open, and he's saying, hey, your parents and their parents all struggled with this thing. And I'm here as a physician to say, are you ready for this to be healed yet? Are you ready for this to be taken care of yet? So really, this is actually a paradigm shift, because this changes this verse from the idea that God is punishing us from generation to generation to generation, to the fact that God is like a doctor. He's trying to heal every generation. And every single generation, God comes to every new generation and he says, okay, now you have a decision to do better than your parents did before you. Okay, now you have a decision to actually break the cycle. And I'm going to give you power through the Holy Spirit to actually do that. But you have an opportunity now to break the cycle that has continued. So in my life, I find myself, it's actually a really weighty and high calling, that I have 5 generations of men in my family who had affairs on their wives. And so to break the cycle, man, I have to work extra hard. I have to work harder than some of you who don't have that cycle in your family. and I have to take extra precautions, and I have to have extra boundaries, and I have to be more intentional. I have to live to a higher standard. I have to have more integrity because of that. And some of you have patterns in your life, in your families, where you have to work a little bit harder than other families would have had to do, right? And perhaps you feel that weight. You've been carrying it. But man, this is a good word about God. This is such a good word about God. I'm going long, but it's because I think that this is such good news for us, that God is so much better than we think. And this is actually why I love the Old Testament, because when we dig in, we understand what God is saying. It makes me love God even more, because I realize, man, God, look at you. You're coming to every generation like a doctor, and you want to heal us. But God will not force us, as we know, He will not force us to be healed. We find that God actually loves us enough to give us a choice. He loves us enough to give us a choice. I want to end with this quote by Tim Mackey. He says, "The biblical authors want us to see God's judgment on us like this: God will give us what we want." God will give us what we want. If we want death, He will give us death. God will let us go. And we see that, the children of Israel, right? We see that in that story, where those people, they had circled around the wilderness for so long, and 10 times they had rebelled against God, over and over and over. He had been good to them over and over and over again. And then finally, after the first time, God should have let them go and said, okay, you don't want this, I'm going to let you go. But no, He sticks around for time after time after time after time. And then finally He says, you don't want what I have to give you. So some of you won't enter the promised land, not because I'm mean, not because I'm petty or vindictive, but because you don't actually want it. But for those who do want to break the cycle, for those who do want something new, God says yes every time. Amen.